Buongiorno e benvenuti. This is a special feature Britlit 10 video podcast on British romantics in Italy with your guide, Dr. Masulo. Our first stop is the Galleria Borghese in Rome. Built in the 17th century, it was once home to one of Europe's most powerful families, the Borgias. The grounds of Casina Borghese included a petting zoo of exotic animals and a vast English garden. The Borgias were also patrons of the arts, and they amassed what would become one of Europe's most prized collections of paintings and sculptures, including those by Titian, Bellini, Caravaggio, Rubens, and Bernini. Today, the Galleria Borghese is one of the most important repositories of art in the world. But a visit to such an impressive home would be incomplete without someone to greet you as you arrive. Awaiting as you enter the villa grounds is none other than our old friend, Lord Byron. This statue finds him staring into the distance and looking rather, well, Byronic. The inscription at the statue's base is a verse from Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, the poem that made him famous and from which apostrophe to the ocean comes. The verse reads, "But I have lived and have not lived in vain. My mind may lose its force, my blood its fire, and my frame perish even in conquering pain. But there is that within me which shall tire torture and time, and breathe when I expire." Byron's legacy and his continued cultural impact stand as testimony to the truth of these lines. Byron, of course, wasn't the only romantic poet who found himself a second home in Italy. Percy Shelley was there too, along with his wife, Mary. To pick up that thread of our tale, we must take a quick detour out of Rome and head north to Florence. As you arrive in Florence by train, you walk out onto the Via Valfonda, one of the city's main thoroughfares. Across from the train station, there is a building that looks fairly nondescript, but if you look at it closely, there's a plaque on the facade, and you will see that there is something special about the place, after all. Here is the plaque. And here's what it says in English. Percy and Mary Shelley spent a lot of time in Florence, which is where he wrote some of his epic poem Prometheus Unbound, as well as the poem we read a few days ago, Ode to the West Wind. The Shelleys lived in a building on this very spot. That building, which, if we are to believe contemporary accounts, was rather nice, was destroyed by Allied bombers during the Second World War. This rather boring building was erected in its place shortly after the war, when Italy was a country racked by deprivation and destruction. Let us return then to Rome. As you head towards city's center, you come across a building that is now the Central Italian Bank. This building, however, wasn't always a bank. It used to be an apartment building. You'll notice that here too, there's a plaque on its facade. Here is what the plaque looks like up close. And here is an English translation. What's important to recognize here is that while the Italians celebrated Shelley's work in the century after his death, they didn't sugarcoat how most people felt about him when he was alive. Shelley was routinely despised by those in power, not only because his views about politics and religion were so well articulated in his writing, but because his writing held those in power to account for their abuses, and it imagined a world in which ordinary people could be free of oppression and fear. A few blocks away from the central bank is the Piazza de Spanier, known in English as the Spanish Steps. 200 years ago, it was a quiet, respectable neighborhood, and largely residential. Today, it's a very popular tourist destination, and many of the world's most venerated names in fashion, Gucci, Dolce & Gabbana, Armani, Versace, Chanel, and Prada, just to name a few, have showrooms nearby. If you look to the right of the picture, you will see a pale orange and cream-colored building. Let's head down the steps and around to the front of it. This is the building where John Keats lived in Rome. It's also where he died. This is where his bedroom was. Today, the building is known as the Keats-Shelley Memorial House, a museum and one of the leading archives for scholars of Romantic poetry and poets. Before we go in, it's worth noting the shirt-making shop next to the Keats-Shelley Memorial House. Sadly, the proprietor closed its doors in 2013, after decades in this location. Let's go in. A brass plaque greets us at the door. A winding flight of stairs leads to the main exhibition room. The walls are lined with books both by and about the Romantic poets that you've been studying in this class. The collection includes original manuscripts, letters, personal items, and other artifacts that have kept literary scholars busy since the museum was founded in 1909. Originally, the main exhibition room was divided into two smaller rooms using a tall curtain placed at the archway. One room served as the entrance room, and the other, which would have been on the far side of the archway in this photograph, served as the landlady's room. A third room, which would have been on the opposite side of the entrance room when Keats was living here, served as the bedroom for his traveling companion, the artist Joseph Severn. What was once Severn's room is now his secondary exhibition room. Here, too, books line the walls and artifacts fill the cases. One artifact worth pointing out is John Keats's life mask, an impression of his visage that was taken when he was about 20 years old. In an era when photographs didn't exist, such masks were a way to have your likeness preserved for posterity. Let's move from this room into the next one, John Keats's bedroom. A brass plaque on the wall tells us much of what we need to know. Here is the bedroom as it appears today. Artifacts from Keats's life line the walls, and the furniture is where it would have been when he lived and died here. Each piece of furniture is a reproduction. All of Keats's actual furniture was burned upon his death, as it would have been for anyone who died of an infectious disease such as tuberculosis. Here is the ceiling in Keats's bedroom. One can imagine the hours that Keats spent looking at it, unable to move out of his bed. On the walls are some of the most important artifacts of Keats's life and work. Here is the actual illustration Keats made of the Sosabios vase, which he famously copied from a book on antiques. It is one of several vases that he had in mind when he wrote Ode on a Grecian Urn. Here is the original portrait of Keats painted by his friend Joseph Severn. You will recall that it was Severn who traveled with Keats to Rome, and it was Severn who stayed with Keats as he died. You'll also note that this image and the next one are reprinted in your Romantic poetry package for this class. Here is the original illustration that Severn made of Keats as he lay dying. It is the last known image of the poet, made while he was still alive. Here is a photograph of Keats's beloved Fanny Brawne, taken nearly 30 years after the poet's passing. It would take Fanny a month to learn of Keats's death when a letter from Severn finally reached home. She cut her hair short and went into mourning for over 6 years, wearing nothing but black clothing and rarely leaving her home. She came out of mourning to resume her life, eventually marrying and having several children before her own death at the age of 65. Here is the space where Keats's writing desk would have been. The original desk was destroyed by fire in accordance with Italian health codes, but through this replica we can appreciate the view that Keats had of the Spanish Steps on those days when he was well enough to write. This is Keats's death mask. Although it may seem macabre to us, death masks were common from antiquity right until the 20th century. The impression was taken as soon after expiration as possible. Sometimes the mask was the basis for a sculpture or a painting by which to remember the subject. Other times, as here, the mask itself was the memorial. And with this, we leave the Keats-Shelley Memorial House behind and move to another part of Rome. Campo Cestio, on the outskirts of what was once ancient Rome. Campo Cestio is also known as the cemetery for non-Catholic foreigners. Such a name might seem strange to us, but it's important to remember that the vast majority of Italians are Roman Catholic. So this cemetery was founded in the late 18th century to inter the remains of Protestant, Jewish, and non-believing Europeans who came to Italy to live and to die. Nearly 300 years old, Campo Cestio is both beautiful and dense with graves, and it holds the remains of people from all over the world. It's in a quiet section of Rome, far from the touristy bustle of the Colosseum and the Spanish Steps, and it's a great place to pass an afternoon in quiet contemplation. See the man on the left in this photograph? That's my dad. Let's follow him to the far corner of the cemetery, where things are also quiet, but a little less crowded. We'll make our way down this path for a bit, until we come to what is now known as Keats's Corner, the last resting place of the youngest Romantic poet. There's a bench here where people come from all over the world to sit and to read poetry and to think. Keats's grave can be seen here on the left. On the right, the grave of his friend, the artist Joseph Severn. Keats's headstone is among the most famous in all of Europe, for whom it commemorates, for what it looks like, and for what it says. Thanks in large part to the literary establishment's hostility towards his work, Keats was convinced that he would never be recognized as a poet, and that he would fade into oblivion, unacknowledged and unknown. The first thing that you will notice is the lyre at the top of the stone. As you know, the lyre is the symbol of poetry. It's an image that has surfaced many times in this class throughout the school year. Keats instructed that this image figure prominently on his headstone. A closer inspection, however, reveals that the lyre on Keats's headstone is missing several strings, an admission by Keats of his failure as a poet. The inscription on the headstone has a history of its own. You will notice that nowhere on the headstone do we find Keats's name or his date of birth. Faced with his own mortality and convinced of his own obscurity, Keats instructed his friends to write on his tombstone only this epitaph: "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." When Keats died, one of his closest friends, a man named Charles Armitage Brown, was so grief-stricken at the loss and so angry at Keats's mistreatment at the hands of his critics that he insisted that this be added. It reads, "This grave contains all that was mortal of a young English poet who, on his deathbed, in the bitterness of his heart, at the malicious power of his enemies, desired these words to be engraven on his tombstone: Here lies one whose name was writ in water." It's impossible to say how Keats might have felt about this, of course, and Brown himself would come to regret his having added these words. Nevertheless, it is safe to say that history vindicated both Brown and the poet whom he loved. In fact, after Keats's death, his friends rallied not only to preserve his memory, but to secure his fame as one of England's greatest poets. Giving public lectures and writing in literary journals and magazines, they advocated tirelessly on his behalf in both Britain and the United States. In Rome, they responded to the poet's claim that his name was written in water with a memorial of their own, placed directly across from Keats's headstone. The memorial depicts Keats' likeness encircled by the poet's laurel, the symbol of poetic mastery. The inscription at bottom reads, "Keats, if thy cherished name be written in water, each drop has fallen from some mourner's cheek, a sacred tribute such as heroes seek, though oft in vain for dazzling deeds of slaughter sleep on, not honored less for epitaphs so meek." Through efforts such as these in the decades after his death, Keats assumed a place in the pantheon of English poets that he never would have dreamed possible in his life. Among Keats's early defenders, of course, was Percy Shelley, and it was he who suggested that Keats relocate to Italy to regain his health. In 1820, Shelley wrote to Keats and invited Keats to join him and his wife Mary in Pisa, an offer that the ailing poet politely declined. When Shelley learned that Keats had died, he paid tribute in a long pastoral poem that he entitled Adonais, an elegy on the death of John Keats. Keats is represented in the poem through its main character, Adonais. The name Adonais is a hybrid of Shelley's own invention and comes from Adonis, the name of the Greek god of fertility, and Adonai, one of the names of the God of the Hebrew Bible. Shelley chose the name not only because it scanned well, fitting neatly into the poem's iambic rhythm, but also because it suggested that Keats was a god of immense creative power. Shelley was proud of Adonais, and scholars consider it to be one of his best and most important works. In the preface to the poem, Shelley describes the beauty of the cemetery, a place with which, as we shall see, he had more than a passing familiarity. Shelley writes, "John Keats died at Rome of a consumption in his 24th year, and was buried in the romantic and lonely cemetery of the Protestants in that city. The cemetery is an open space along the ruins covered in winter with violets, daisies. It might make one in love with death to think that one should be buried in so sweet a place." Adonais was published in July of 1821, about 5 months after Keats's death. Exactly a year later, in July of 1822, Shelley himself would perish, and he too would be buried here in this romantic and lonely cemetery among the violets and the daisies. Shelley admired Keats's poetry, but, despite having mutual friends, the two never became more than acquaintances. Keats did have close friends, of course, and among them none fought so fiercely for him as the artist Joseph Severn. Severn traveled with Keats to Rome, made arrangements for his medical care, nursed him in his illness, sat at his bedside as he died, and created some of the most important images by which Keats is remembered. Even Severn's headstone speaks of his friendship with Keats and at the work that Severn did to secure Keats's place among the immortal poets of England. If you look behind Severn's grave, you will notice another, smaller headstone. This is the headstone of Severn's son, Arthur, who died before his 8th-month birthday. If he is to be remembered at all, it will be for who his father was, and for who was among the guests at his christening. Arthur Severn is not the only child with romantic associations to be buried at Campoggestio. A few dozen yards from Keats's grave is the headstone of William Shelley, son of Percy and Mary Shelley, who died of an infection in 1819 at the age of 3½. Across from William's grave is the Pyramid of Cestius, which dates to the year 30 BCE. The pyramid is built into the ancient city walls that border the cemetery. This was the wall that marked the city's edge during the heyday of the Roman Empire. In the 21st century, the pyramid was the subject of a cultural preservation project that involved nearly 15 years of research and restoration. If we follow the wall around the cemetery, we find ourselves on a narrow path. This path leads us to our final destination: the grave of Percy Shelley. The headstone reads, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Heart of Hearts, August 4th, 1792 to July 8th, 1822. The epitaph comes from William Shakespeare's play The Tempest. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. You will recall that Shelley died at sea when his ship, the Ariel, sank off the coast of Genoa, Italy. You will also recall that it is said that at the time of his death, Shelley had in his pocket a book of poetry by Keats, who had died the year before. This painting, which is reprinted in your romantic poetry package, imagines the poet's funeral pyre shortly after the discovery of his body. We should be careful not to assume the historical accuracy of this painting, which was produced nearly 70 years after Shelley's death. We do know, however, that Byron was present when Shelley's body was found, and you will also recall that he was among the mourners depicted in this painting, here on the right. On the left is another of Shelley's closest friends, a man named Edward Trelawney. Like Byron and Shelley, Trelawney was a bit of a bad boy. He had money and talent and good looks and a knack for getting in and out of trouble. He had spent a lot of time on the seas as a sailor and an adventurer, and he would fight alongside Byron in the war for Greek independence, a war in which Byron himself would lose his life. Trelawney was also a vocal supporter of democracy and a staunch advocate for women's rights. He wrote a number of books recounting his exploits, including his time with both Shelley and Byron. The legend goes that as Shelley's body burned on the funeral pyre, Trelawney walked up to it and he thrust his hand into Shelley's chest cavity. When Trelawney withdrew his hand, he held in it Shelley's heart. Trelawney took the heart back to England, where he gave it to Mary Shelley. Mary took the heart, wrapped it in the manuscript of one of Shelley's poems, and put it in the top drawer of her writing desk, where it would stay until the end of her life. Whether or not this story is true is open to debate. Trelawney wrote some of the most influential accounts of Shelley's and Byron's lives, but neither poet was available to confirm or deny what he said. So while the story may be true, it is equally possible that Trelawney was simply adding to the already growing myth of these two romantic poets. Nevertheless, the story was powerful enough that when Trelawney himself died at the ripe old age of 88 back in his home country of England, his body was shipped to Rome, where he was buried next to his friend Shelley, and not far from the graves of Keats and his friend Joseph Severn. And that concludes this special feature Britlit 10 video podcast on the Romantics in Italy. Until next time, arrivederci.